I discovered 98 newly constructed houses, valued at $34 million, occupying land that had been in my family for 3 decades. The head of the HOA, a true Karen, believed she had executed the ultimate swindle. Unfortunately for her, she had just unwittingly signed over the title to her entire development to me. Imagine returning home to find a whole subdivision where your herd once roamed. Families were unloading moving trucks, and children were decorating driveways with chalk, all on my land and without my consent. Victoria Ashworth had the nerve to have me served with a restraining order, alleging I was menacing families with my surveying tools. This woman not only stole my property, but then portrayed me as the menacing neighbor who was frightening innocent kids. What she was unaware of was that a 1924 contract from my grandfather stipulated that every single house she erected became mine the instant the first foundation was poured. She would soon discover why one should never try to swindle a land surveyor who has spent 40 years chronicling property theft, particularly when federal statutes are on his side. My name is Ezekiel Thornfield, but my friends know me as Zeke. I'm what you might consider to be of the old school, stubborn Tennessee variety. Now 67, I have dedicated 40 years of my life to being a land surveyor, tracing property lines, and resolving boundary conflicts across 3 different counties. My grandfather bequeathed to me 847 acres of prime, rolling hills in 94, accompanied by a valuable piece of wisdom. Boy, never put your faith in a man who measures land without getting his boots dirty. The morning haze here in Millbrook County is tinged with the sweet fragrance of honeysuckle blending with the diesel fumes from the nearby interstate. I suppose that's the scent of progress encroaching on rural farmlands. At every sunrise, I would patrol my fence lines with a cup of black coffee, the sound of gravel crunching under my boots, inspecting for any damage from storms. The distinct metallic note of well water and the earthy aroma of my cattle served as a reminder that this was authentic farming, a far cry from the suburban ideal that was spreading across Tennessee. My late wife, Martha, often remarked that I maintained my property records with the same obsessive pride that other men reserve for collecting baseball cards, a dedication bordering on madness. Following her passing 5 years ago, our 2 children left to pursue their urban ambitions in Portland and Atlanta. I can't hold it against them for seeking more stimulation than what watching grass grow can offer, but it left me rattling about in a 1952 farmhouse, with only my heritage cattle and cherished memories for company. Then came Victoria Ashworth. Please, call me Vicky. She was the type of person who wielded a clipboard like a tactical weapon and communicated in a passive-aggressive corporate jargon that could provoke Gandhi to violence. At 52, she had perfected the suburban HOA president aesthetic, salon-fresh blonde highlights, a white Lexus SUV that was detailed weekly, and the vacant smile of someone who has reported neighbors for having a mailbox painted in a non-compliant shade. Vicky is married to Brad Ashworth, our local councilman, which in Sweetwater Springs gives her a sense of entitlement akin to royalty. For 8 years, she had been circling my land like a vulture, dispatching intermediaries with offensively low offers for my unused pasture. The scent of her desperation was more potent than her department store fragrance each time she appeared unannounced with another generous offer. The real issues began upon my return from a 3-week trip to Oregon, where I was assisting my daughter Sarah through a complicated divorce. I had been anticipating a return to my tranquil routine, coffee at dawn, tending to the cattle, and perhaps mending some fence posts if I felt energetic. It was the sort of retirement devoid of conference calls and HOA disputes. However, as I drove up my gravel driveway, a sense of unease settled over me. In place of the lowing of cattle and the songs of meadowlarks, I was met with the suburban cacophony of humming lawnmowers and shrieking children, sounds that had no place on my back 40 acres. I retrieved my surveying gear and walked toward the commotion, assuming some teenagers were trespassing or a family's car had broken down near my property line. As I walked across my pasture, the air was filled with the unfamiliar smells of new asphalt and freshly cut lumber, replacing the usual scents of wildflowers and creek water. The sight that met my eyes caused my coffee mug to fall from my grasp and shatter on a limestone boulder. Spread across my land like a suburban blight were 98 immaculate houses. Neatly trimmed lawns had replaced the grazing grounds of my Angus cattle. A decorative stone entrance announced Heritage Meadows Estates, in a script more elaborate than a formal wedding invitation. There were families unloading moving vans, children creating chalk art on driveways, and golden retrievers fetching tennis balls. The complete American dream tableau had been constructed on every acre of my back pasture. I just stood there, staring in disbelief like a lost tourist, questioning if I had mistakenly driven into the wrong county. But I could see my grandfather's oak tree, bearing Martha's carved initials, and there was Willow Creek, where I had first learned to fish. This was undeniably my land, yet someone had transformed it into a suburban neighborhood without seeking my permission. It was at that moment that Vicky appeared, driving a golf cart and sporting an official HOA badge. She approached me as if she owned the entire area, and from her self-satisfied expression, it was clear she genuinely thought she did. "Excuse me, sir," she declared, her voice laced with a syrupy sweetness that made my jaw tense instantly. "This is private property. Heritage Meadows is a gated community intended for residents and their invited guests only." I surveyed my trees, my creek, the very land where my grandfather had instilled in me the importance of respecting property boundaries, and it dawned on me that I was on the verge of receiving a profound lesson in small-town corruption. "Ma'am," I responded, my voice remaining firm despite the urge to erupt. "I believe there has been some sort of misunderstanding. This is my property. It has been since 1994. Vicky's laugh was as grating as fingernails on a chalkboard. "Oh, honey, I think you're the one who's mistaken. The Heritage Meadows development was acquired legally from Millbrook Development Corporation 2 years ago." She produced a folder so thick it could have choked a horse, leafing through its pages with the assurance of a person who has never been questioned. "See? It's right here. 847 acres bought at fair market value. I'm positive this is merely a surveying mistake on your part." The condescension in her tone caused my blood pressure to soar. Yet, 40 years of handling property disputes had taught me the value of documenting everything and remaining composed when faced with someone attempting to rob you in broad daylight. "Would you mind if I took a look at those documents?" "I'm not legally obligated to disclose private HOA matters to trespassers," she retorted sharply, clutching the folder as if it held the nation's nuclear launch codes. "But I'll tell you what, since I'm in a generous mood today, these families have children who are due to start school in 2 weeks. I'm certain we can find an arrangement that won't disrupt their lives." It was then that I understood this was no mistake. It was a meticulously planned swindle, cloaked in suburban self-righteousness. 3 days later, Deputy Mike Ashworth appeared at my door, carrying legal papers and a smirk that conveyed everything I needed to know about receiving fair treatment in this county. The restraining order alleged that I had trespassed onto Heritage Meadows property and had threatened residents in a menacing way with my surveying equipment. It seemed that carrying a measuring tape was now considered brandishing a weapon. The order forbade me from setting foot on my own back 40 acres, and Mike was careful to point out that any violation would result in jail time. Vicky, however, was not finished with her campaign of suburban warfare. Within a week, every resident of Heritage Meadows received a letter describing the unstable former landowner who represented a potential safety risk to families and children. She established a neighborhood safety committee that patrolled my property line with the vigilance of border guards, taking pictures of me feeding my own cattle as though I were operating a meth lab. The assault on social media followed. Vicky posted contrasting photos on the Sweetwater Springs Facebook group, my weathered farmhouse against the pristine subdivision, asserting that my unkempt property was attracting vermin and diminishing property values. The comments section erupted into a digital battlefield, pitting longtime locals who knew my family against newcomers who had fallen for Vicky's portrayal hook, line, and sinker. But this is where 4 decades of surveying experience truly pays off. While Vicky was preoccupied with portraying herself as the victim online, I went to the county courthouse and began to pull records. The filing fee for the supposed property transfer immediately drew my attention, a mere $50. During my early days as a surveyor, I had learned that Tennessee law mandates that major property transfers must have a notarized affidavit with several witnesses and filing fees that correspond to the value of the transaction. This whole affair smelled more suspicious than week-old catfish. The definitive proof was the notary's stamp. Eleanor Hutchkins had overseen real estate closings for 30 years. She was a kind, elderly woman who made the finest peach cobbler in the county. The issue was, Eleanor had passed away 6 months before she supposedly notarized my property transfer. Unless she was signing documents from beyond the grave, someone had forged her stamp. I contacted my old surveying associate, Clarence Bulldog McKinsey, a man who has forgotten more about property law than most attorneys ever learn. Bulldog spent 2 days with his GPS equipment, meticulously walking every inch of my boundaries, spitting tobacco juice and grumbling about amateurish fraud attempts. "Zeke," he finally declared, "your property lines are precise to within 6 inches. That entire subdivision is sitting on your land like a swarm of fleas on a hound dog." While I was methodically building my case, Vicky escalated her tactics to psychological warfare. Sentinel Security Services began to patrol Heritage Meadows in golf carts, equipped with radio headsets, as if my Angus cattle posed a significant terrorist threat. Next came the complaint filed with the state licensing board, which claimed I was experiencing mental decline and was a danger to public safety. Her evidence? My insistence on accessing my own property. The county then joined in, threatening to condemn my farmhouse as a public nuisance. Apparently, 70 years of honest wear and tear had made my home an eyesore when compared to the cookie-cutter McMansions encroaching on my pasture. That evening, as I was checking my fence line in the fading light, I observed something that made my skin crawl. Security cameras concealed in my oak trees, with cables running back towards Heritage Meadows. The acrid smell of electrical connections and freshly cut plastic told the whole story. They had been tapping into my power meter to operate their surveillance equipment. Years ago, I had assisted a client in catching copper thieves using an electromagnetic field detector from the local hardware store, and the same method revealed that they had been monitoring me without authorization for months. I sat in Martha's garden as the crickets chirped and the fragrance of her climbing roses filled the evening air, contemplating whether I should just accept whatever some Vicky offered and move to a warmer climate. Then, I recalled my grandfather's words after the railroad company attempted to seize our mineral rights back in '89. "Son, when someone attempts to steal your land, they are not merely taking dirt. They are stealing your family's history." Martha had concurred, noting in her journal that night, "Zeke never hesitates to protect what is right." It was time to uphold that legacy. 2 weeks later, Vicky played her media card. Channel 7 News arrived at Heritage Meadows as if covering a presidential assassination, complete with a satellite truck and enough camera gear to shoot a Hollywood blockbuster. The headline? "Elderly Man's Delusions Threaten Young Families." They interviewed concerned mothers holding designer babies, depicted me as a bewildered hermit trapped in the past, and granted Vicky 5 uninterrupted minutes to deliver her Oscar-worthy performance as a victim. "We just want to live in peace," she lamented, dabbing at her eyes with tissues that seemed suspiciously dry. "It is heartbreaking to witness someone in such a state of confusion, but we cannot allow one person's mental decline to put our children at risk." The news segment portrayed me as the antagonist in a Lifetime movie about suburban horror. But while Vicky was busy vying for Emmy Awards for her feigned tears, I was engaged in what surveyors do best, tracing paper trails and connecting the dots. The following morning, my property insurance was canceled. The letter stated that a significant change in land usage had voided my policy based on aerial photographs showing residential development. Now, here's an interesting fact I learned while assisting my neighbor Jim in uncovering insurance fraud back in '03. Agents sometimes use their internal access to initiate cancellations, leaving their victims exposed just before something unfortunate occurs. As it turned out, little Vicky was employed part-time at Mutual Trust Insurance, the very company that had terminated my policy. She had exploited her access to their database to sabotage my coverage, timing it flawlessly with her legal assault. The true nature of the legal system became apparent when Judge Harold Peton scheduled an emergency hearing. Peton played golf with Brad every Thursday and held shares in 3 development companies. The concept of a conflict of interest was clearly not in his vocabulary. My court-appointed lawyer arrived smelling of bourbon and mispronounced my name twice before recommending that I accept reality and enter into negotiations. When I insisted on a jury trial, the hearing was postponed indefinitely, likely in the hope that I would pass away from old age first. Meanwhile, Vicky persuaded the families of Heritage Meadows that their property values would plummet if the crazy old man were to win. She established a defense fund and raised $50,000 for legal costs. It's amusing how that money was used to finance the Ashworth's European vacation. Brad's Facebook photos from wine tours in Tuscany were quite revealing. The residents organized car washes and bake sales, unwittingly funding their own exploitation with the fervor of cult members. I was not, however, remaining passive. Every conversation was recorded on my smartphone, using an app that Sarah had installed, complete with timestamps and GPS coordinates that would be admissible in federal court. I installed trail cameras along the perimeter of my property, all legally positioned, which captured every detail of their harassment campaign. The intimidation tactics escalated rapidly. Dead animals began to appear on my porch, mostly possums, though one day someone escalated to a raccoon that smelled as foul as week-old roadkill. Nails were strewn across my driveway, causing my truck tires to go flat on 2 occasions. Anonymous phone calls delivered threats. Accidents tend to happen to stubborn old men, always at 3 a.m., when the menace felt most palpable. They obstructed access to my own mailbox, asserting that it was located on a Heritage Meadows easement. Sentinel security guards threatened me with arrest if I tried to retrieve my own mail. The irony of them stealing mail while accusing me of trespassing was not lost on anyone with a modicum of intelligence. It was at this point that my guardian angel appeared, dressed in jeans and carrying a notebook. Ruby Morgan, an investigative reporter for the Nashville Tribune, had relocated to small-town Tennessee in search of tranquility after burning out in the big city. She contacted me after viewing Channel 7's character assassination piece. Her legal reporting instincts were blaring, signaling that something was more foul than my septic tank. "Mr. Thornfield," she began, "I've covered enough white-collar crime to know a con job when I see one. Would you mind if I took a look at your documents?" Ruby dedicated 3 days to independently scrutinizing public records, verifying my ownership, and finding that Heritage Meadows marketing materials were dated 2 years prior to the supposed purchase. Her background in covering financial fraud had taught her that internet archives are infallible. The Wayback Machine unearthed deleted web pages that displayed development plans from 2021, establishing premeditation. She also discovered Brad's sealed juvenile record for real estate fraud in Kentucky. Our town councilman had a history of property theft, though he had never attempted it on such a grand scale before. The county then escalated its threats to eminent domain, asserting that Heritage Meadows was providing essential housing for the community's growth. They appraised my 847 acres at an agricultural value of $80,000, completely disregarding the $12 million residential potential. It was a classic case of government-sanctioned theft: acquire property for a fraction of its worth and then hand it over to developer allies for millions. My water well was contaminated overnight. My cattle began to display symptoms of poisoning, which were traced back to storm drain runoff from Heritage Meadows. The subdivision was in violation of environmental regulations, as toxic construction materials were leaching into the groundwater that supplied my well and Willow Creek. The stress finally took its toll on me, leading to a hospital admission for chest pains. The doctors advised me to reduce conflict and consider assisted living. It was then that Vicky showed her true colors, visiting me with crocodile tears and a settlement offer of $200,000. "Zeke," she whispered, leaning over my hospital bed like a vulture, "this could all be over by tomorrow. Think about your family. Is this dirt really worth dying for?" Lying in that hospital bed, with the beeping of heart monitors, the stinging smell of antiseptic in my nostrils, and 4 needles in my arm, I came to a realization. This was about more than just a property dispute. It was about bringing to justice criminals who had deceived an entire community while cloaking themselves in a veneer of suburban respectability. It was time to fight back. Leaving that hospital bed felt like emerging from a nightmare directly into a battlefield. During my time as an invalid, Vicky and Brad had been actively solidifying their theft through political maneuvers so slick they would have impressed Las Vegas swindlers. Brad had proposed an emergency city council resolution to annex Heritage Meadows into the Sweetwater Springs city limits. This was a bureaucratic masterstroke that struck me with the force of a brick to the head. City jurisdiction would supersede county property laws, bringing the subdivision under municipal authority where Brad's influence was more profound than a Tennessee sinkhole. They had expedited the vote to take place in just 10 days, concealing the notice in the legal classifieds, a section that only lawyers and land surveyors would typically read. Ruby's investigation intensified, exposing document fraud so extensive it made the Watergate scandal seem like a minor mishap. Computer forensics showed that Brad's operation had been copying and pasting notary stamps, appropriating digital signatures from legitimate transactions in the same way a teenager might pirate movies. The forgery of Eleanor Hutchkins's stamp was not an anomaly. They had been illicitly using the identities of deceased notaries across 4 counties. The families in Heritage Meadows began to receive special HOA assessments that would make a loan shark seem generous. Vicky was demanding thousands of dollars from each household to finance the legal defense, with threats of foreclosure for those who didn't pay. She was effectively extorting the very people she claimed to be protecting, making them pay exorbitant amounts to defend property they didn't even legally own. The irony was as thick as Martha's cornbread. Residents were paying to facilitate the theft of their own money. Several families reached out to me in secret, their voices shaking during phone calls made late at night after their children were asleep. They had begun to question why their HOA leader required funds for BMW payments to contest a single old man armed with a measuring tape. With Ruby's newspaper funding, I hired an independent building inspector. It appears that journalistic integrity sometimes includes a budget for uncovering corruption. His findings would have made my surveyor's soul ache. He identified 47 significant code violations, which included houses constructed on wooden platforms over buried swampland without the necessary septic permits. The electrical systems were in such severe violation of county fire codes that a single spark could have turned Heritage Meadows into a suburban inferno. Vicky's desperation reached a new high when she attempted to bribe Dr. Stevens into declaring me mentally incompetent. She offered him $20,000 to forge a dementia diagnosis and advocate for guardianship proceedings. The honorable doctor recorded their entire conversation. She had also engaged a disreputable private investigator to concoct false stories about my military service, claims so absurd that any veteran could easily refute them in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. The environmental discovery was as shocking as a lightning strike on a golf course. Ruby found out that Heritage Meadows had been constructed on federally protected wetlands without obtaining the required EPA permits, thereby violating more environmental laws than an oil spill. The original survey had been falsified by Brad's consulting firm, which had described the sensitive marsh habitat as insignificant grassland. They had obliterated the breeding grounds of a rare salamander, which triggered violations of the Endangered Species Act, carrying daily fines of $25,000, enough to purchase every home in the subdivision twice over. Danny Kowalski finally decided to speak out after months of threats directed at his family. The former construction foreman supplied copies of the authentic environmental survey, along with photographs of Brad instructing crews to pour concrete over the protected wetlands. Danny had resigned rather than be a part of the environmental desecration and had subsequently faced harassment for possessing a conscience, a quality that seems to be in short supply in the construction industry these days. Ruby's financial inquiry traced the funding for Heritage Meadows through a labyrinth of shell companies, more intricate than a game of 3-card Monte, leading to overseas accounts that screamed money laundering more loudly than a tornado siren. The construction loans had been obtained using my property as collateral without my consent, constituting fraud so audacious that bank executives would be facing federal conspiracy charges once this scheme unraveled. The awakening for the homeowners was both harsh and immediate. Their property deeds were invalid. Their title insurance policies had clauses that excluded coverage for contested land, and families were now at risk of losing their homes while still being liable for mortgages on properties they never legally owned. Secret meetings among residents began to spring up like mushrooms after a downpour, where they discussed class action lawsuits against the very people who had sold them the American dream, a dream built upon an environmental catastrophe. Vicky announced a Heritage Meadows Family Festival to showcase community solidarity, her last-ditch effort to garner public sympathy. She invited politicians, law enforcement, and the media to observe how ordinary families were being intimidated by a single, troubled neighbor. The festival was scheduled for the same day as the city council's annexation vote, a strategic move to sway politicians with images of children enjoying bounce houses while the crazy old farmer attempted to seize their homes. However, two could play at the timing game. Ruby arranged for federal EPA inspectors to conduct their wetlands investigation on the day of the festival. Danny consented to testify about the environmental cover-ups. I had put together evidence packages that detailed the full extent of the fraud, including my grandfather's 1924 railroad contracts, which these amateurs had failed to research. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would bring to light 2 decades of corruption in front of half the county. The sweet aroma of barbecue smoke and cotton candy would soon be mingled with the sharp stench of burning lies. Vicky believed she was engineering a public relations triumph to secure her theft. In reality, she was on the verge of learning why you should never steal from a man who has documented every square inch of land in 3 counties. The festival day was fast approaching, and I intended to give Heritage Meadows a celebration they would never forget. Ruby's phone call at 6 a.m., just 3 days before the festival, altered the entire situation. "Zeke, you need to get to the courthouse basement immediately. I've discovered something that is going to shatter this case like dynamite in a henhouse." I drove through a morning fog as dense as Martha's gravy, my heart pounding more fiercely than a teenager's on a first date. Ruby was waiting for me at the courthouse's rear entrance, her hair disheveled, clutching coffee-stained documents as if she had unearthed the holy grail from beneath decades of bureaucratic grime. "The railway archives," she panted, leading me down rickety wooden stairs into a basement that smelled of mothballs and forgotten history. I was looking into easement law for another article when I came across these treasures. She laid out yellow documents on a table beneath fluorescent lights that flickered like moribund fireflies. They were the original 1924 railroad easement contracts, sealed in manila envelopes that had not seen the light of day since Eisenhower was in office. The aged paper crackled under my touch like dry autumn leaves. Suddenly, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice resonating through the past 9 decades. "Your grandfather was an absolute genius, Zeke. Take a look at Clause 7. My hands shook as I read the faded typewritten words that would make contemporary lawyers weep with admiration. Ezekiel Thornfield, Sr., had not only negotiated mineral rights with the Tennessee Central Railroad, he had also secured development protections more solid than Fort Knox. Any unauthorized structures erected on Thornfield property would automatically transfer ownership to the family, along with every single improvement, fixture, and blade of grass." "Good heavens," I murmured, the metallic taste of shock sharp in my mouth. Grandpa foresaw this a century ago. The language of the contract was irrefutable. Unauthorized construction would instantly nullify any competing land claims and convey all improvements to the rightful owner. Having been filed with the Federal Railway Commission, it possessed a jurisdiction that made state property laws seem like mere suggestions scribbled on cocktail napkins. No county judge, city council, or HOA president could challenge these rights. They were safeguarded by a federal transportation law that predated sliced bread. Ruby's investigative work had uncovered the conclusive evidence. My property actually extended 200 feet beyond the current survey markers, covering not just the 98 houses, but also the Heritage Meadows clubhouse, swimming pool, tennis courts, and the cherished 9-hole golf course where Brad played every weekend. Satellite images from 2019 revealed that the boundary stakes had been suspiciously moved during one of my trips to Oregon. The total theft includes recreational facilities valued at $8 million, Ruby stated, spreading out printouts like a car dealer in Las Vegas. "According to your grandfather's contract, Vicky has just presented you with a $42 million gift, wrapped in suburban ignorance." The profound irony of it all made me laugh until tears streamed down my face. 98 houses, each worth $350,000, plus all the amenities, were now mine, all because of a contract these amateurs had never bothered to look up. The 1924 agreement was not subject to any statute of limitations, which meant that their fraudulent activities had, in fact, fortified my legal standing rather than jeopardized it. Ruby had uncovered Brad's connection to the Railway Historical Society and found that he had accessed these very documents 3 years prior during some genealogical research. Email evidence exposed a meticulously detailed plan for the theft. He was aware of the easement clause but had gambled that I would never discover the original contracts. He believed he could outwit a family that has been documenting property rights since Warren G. Harding was president, Ruby noted with a chuckle. But he made a critical error in judgment. The insurance ramifications were immense. Heritage Meadows was covered by $50 million in fraudulent policies, all based on falsified ownership documents. When this scheme fell apart, the insurance companies would be facing liability claims larger than their executive compensation packages. The federal jurisdiction meant that the Ashworths could no longer be shielded by local corruption. U.S. Marshals would enforce the 1924 contract with an authority that would make county sheriffs look like shopping mall security. The strategic upper hand was now decisively mine. I no longer needed to prove my ownership, as my grandfather's contract automatically conferred it upon me. Vicky's festival was set to become her public downfall, and she was about to provide me with the means to make it happen, all while the cameras were rolling. Ruby's kitchen table was buried under an avalanche of legal papers, maps, laptops, and a sufficient number of coffee cups to power a NASA mission. The sweet fragrance of her homemade blueberry muffins clashed with the sharp smell of printer ink as we meticulously planned the collapse of the Heritage Meadows suburban dynasty. Martha would have cherished this organized chaos, driven by a righteous cause. Marcus Webb arrived, the very picture of federal justice in a well-fitted suit. This silver-haired prosecutor had dedicated 40 years to incarcerating white-collar offenders, and his wire-rimmed spectacles had seen more courtroom triumphs than a Kentucky Derby winner. He examined our evidence with meticulous care. Your grandfather's 1924 contract is more solid than the bark on a tree, Marcus affirmed, arranging the yellow documents like a hand of poker cards. I've handled 12 railway easement cases. This language is so airtight it could halt a freight train. Dr. Sarah Lightfoot participated via video conference, her EPA credentials adding environmental felonies to our expanding list of accusations. The assessment of the wetlands damage was enough to make my surveyor's soul grieve. It would cost $15 million to restore a habitat that had taken centuries to form. The salamander species they wiped out is federally protected, Dr. Lightfoot stated, her voice resonating with the authority of congressional testimony. The daily fines accumulate more rapidly than a teenager's credit card balance. We are talking about generational bankruptcy. Danny Kowalski showed up, looking like a man burdened by months of concrete-related guilt. The former construction foreman laid out blueprints on Ruby's table, pointing out engineering flaws that would make any builder's insurance provider swoon. These houses are death traps built on stilts, Danny remarked, his calloused finger tracing the foundation plans. Brad opted for pressure-treated lumber instead of proper concrete pilings to cut costs. Families are residing in expensive houseboats that are unaware they are slowly sinking. The dark humor was not lost on anyone present. The residents of Heritage Meadows were, quite literally, living on borrowed time. Patty Goldman, our forensic accountant, pieced together the financial puzzle with the excitement of someone who had discovered buried treasure within Excel spreadsheets. Her laptop screen displayed money trails that resembled the chaotic art of a drunken toddler. The total fraud surpasses $89 million, Patty declared, each figure striking with the impact of an artillery round. They pre-sold 150 lots using falsified ownership documents. Bernie Madoff would have been impressed by the sheer audacity of this Ponzi scheme. Ruby planned the media strategy with the precision of a military operation, marking a timeline on our whiteboard that resembled D-Day invasion plans. EPA inspection at 11 a.m. during the opening ceremonies, federal marshals at 1 p.m. during the face painting. My story will be published at 2 p.m., just as families are checking their phones over barbecue. The level of coordination impressed even my surveyor's appreciation for meticulous planning. The EPA would address the environmental offenses, the FBI would handle the financial fraud, and the U.S. Marshals would deliver legal documents that local corruption could not intercept, all unfolding with the precision of a Swiss watch engineered by incensed federal agents. My primary concern was safeguarding the innocent families who were ensnared in Vicky's deception. Marcus had looked into victim compensation programs, while I formulated fair rent-to-own agreements for any residents wishing to remain. These people purchased the American dream from professional deceivers, I asserted, the metallic taste of resolve in my mouth signaling that there would be no compromise on my principles. We will expose the perpetrators without causing further harm to the victims. The deployment of technology transformed Ruby's journalism team into a documentary film crew. Unobtrusive recording devices, live streaming capabilities, and evidence-gathering systems were set up to document every moment for federal prosecution and to ensure transparency on social media. The decoy operation demanded acting abilities I never knew I, an old surveyor, possessed. I was to feign negotiations with Vicky during the festival, keeping the Ashworths preoccupied while federal agents maneuvered into position like chess pieces around Heritage Meadows. Reverend James Mitchell lent a moral authority that small-town corruption could not disregard. His Methodist church would provide temporary housing for displaced residents, and his historical knowledge of the Thornfield family's century-long presence in the community added credibility to our cause. Professional exhibits prepared for the media would convey the story visually. Before and after photographs of the destroyed wetlands, side-by-side comparisons of forged documents, and evidence of water contamination would make evening news editors weep with journalistic delight. We had contingency plans for every conceivable worst-case scenario, from local interference to flight risks. Evidence was stored in multiple secure locations. Civil rights attorneys were on standby to counter any retaliation, and 3 national news networks were alerted and ready for potential coverage. The evening prior to the festival, I went to Martha's grave as the sunset painted the sky in hues she had adored, soft purples and golds that served as a reminder of why this land was important beyond its monetary or property value. A line from her journal, written on our 20th anniversary, echoed in my mind. Zeke fights for what is right, not what is easy. Kneeling by her headstone, inhaling the sweet fragrance of the wild honeysuckle that grew around her final resting place, I made a solemn vow. The next day would bring to light 20 years of corruption while ensuring the protection of families who had been victimized by their own aspirations. Vicky had organized a festival to commemorate her theft. Instead, she was about to preside over the most costly public confession in Tennessee's history, served with a measure of federal justice and broadcast live for all with an internet connection to witness. The irony was sweeter than Ruby's blueberry muffins. The morning of the festival dawned with the kind of picture-perfect weather that might have led Vicky to believe that God himself approved of her suburban heist. Heritage Meadows glistened like a film set, adorned with enough balloons and banners to rival Disney World. The mingling scents of barbecue smoke and cotton candy with freshly mown grass created a wholesome, family-friendly atmosphere that would have been delightful had it not been founded on decades of fraud. Vicky had employed every manipulative tactic in the suburban arsenal. A children's choir sang at the opening ceremony. Local politicians delivered speeches on the importance of protecting family values, and media cameras focused on sympathetic families while deliberately ignoring the federal agents who were discreetly positioned around the festival grounds like well-dressed predators. The previous night, someone had severed my internet and phone lines, an amateurish attempt at intimidation that made me laugh more heartily than a Three Stooges film. My truck tires were slashed once more, and a threatening note was left on my windshield. Warning: accidents happen to stubborn old fools. Ruby's car was vandalized with spray paint, proclaiming media lies in letters that resembled a kindergartner's first foray into rebellion. Brad had convened an emergency city council meeting for Saturday morning, urgently pushing for the Heritage Meadows annexation vote with the desperation of a used car salesman on the final day of the month. The day before, 3 council members had received anonymous donations of $10,000 each. Ruby's cameras had captured the cash exchanges in parking lots, resembling scenes from a low-budget espionage movie. My bank accounts were frozen on Friday afternoon, purportedly due to suspicious activity and a money laundering investigation. The bank manager, who was Brad's brother-in-law, declined to provide any details, resorting to bureaucratic jargon that would have impressed a tax lawyer. All of a sudden, I was unable to access funds for legal expenses or even groceries, a form of financial warfare intended to compel my surrender through deprivation. Vicky intensified her manipulation of the families, telling residents that I intended to demolish their houses immediately after winning. leaving children without homes just before the school year started. She created counterfeit social media profiles to disseminate rumors about my mental state with the fervor of a teenage cyberbully. Parents in Heritage Meadows organized protective patrols around the subdivision, as if their children were under threat of invasion from a single old man with surveying tools. The destruction of construction evidence began during the night. Crews showed up with truckloads of clean soil to spread over contaminated ground in an attempt to conceal environmental breaches before the EPA inspection. Danny documented this cover-up with concealed cameras, capturing evidence of federal obstruction of justice, a crime that carries a 5-year prison sentence. Brad reached out to state environmental officials, asserting that Ruby's investigation was fake news, and organized for a sympathetic local television station to interview concerned residents about media harassment. Social media bots inundated Heritage Meadows posts with supportive comments that appeared to be written by the same individual using a thesaurus. Vicky retained Nashville's most aggressive law firm, which filed a $50 million defamation lawsuit against Ruby and her newspaper. They sought a retraction of all fraud-related stories and tried to obtain injunctions to prevent coverage of the festival day. In essence, they were attempting to achieve through legal bullying what they could not achieve through actual innocence. Someone informed EPA inspectors about security threats at the festival, filing anonymous complaints about federal overreach and bureaucratic harassment of working families. Brad's political allies exerted pressure on the EPA to postpone their investigation, engaging in jurisdictional disputes that would make constitutional lawyers despair. The community fractured down the middle like a poorly planned subdivision. Long-standing residents took sides based on grudges that were decades old. Local businesses were threatened with boycotts for supporting either side. The Chamber of Commerce split more quickly than a marriage in divorce court. Security was increased around Heritage Meadows, with guards trailing Ruby as she worked, unmarked vehicles parked outside my property at night, and a harassment campaign that featured construction noise beginning at 6 a.m. every day. The smells of diesel exhaust and dust became perpetual reminders that Vicky was willing to destroy the tranquil countryside to safeguard her ill-gotten gains. Danny Kowalski began receiving death threats, which included family photos marked with red X's, a form of witness intimidation that crossed federal lines into the realm of terrorism. His employer was pressured to dismiss him for unreliable behavior, which led the FBI to place Danny in witness protection. Vicky's desperation sank to a new low when she contacted my adult children in Oregon and Georgia, alleging that their father was experiencing a mental breakdown and proposing guardianship proceedings to protect his assets. She insinuated that I was tarnishing Martha's memory by defending our family's land, a form of psychological manipulation that would be instructive to cult leaders. The insurance fraud was exposed when Ruby found out that the Heritage Meadows policies had been printed on letterhead stolen from legitimate companies. The residents' homeowners' insurance claims would be rejected because the policies were non-existent, leaving families to face financial ruin without any coverage. Brad filed emergency motions to stop the federal investigation, seeking out sympathetic judges and asserting that the agencies did not have jurisdiction over local property matters. He submitted numerous procedural motions aimed at causing delays and confusion, a form of procedural warfare that made the tax code seem straightforward. Festival Day became the decisive battleground where truth would confront suburban falsehoods under the brilliant Tennessee sun. Media crews descended like a cavalry charge. Federal agents took their positions unobtrusively, and the community's tension reached its peak. The sweet aroma of funnel cakes and the innocent laughter of children would soon be mingled with the bitter taste of exposed corruption and the cold serving of federal justice. The morning of the festival dawned with the kind of oppressive humidity that defines Tennessee summers, making tempers shorter than a roadside firecracker. Heritage Meadows resembled a fever dream by Norman Rockwell. Red, white, and blue bunting was draped over the stolen land, and the sound of children's laughter echoed across the wetlands that had been sacrificed for suburban expansion. At the festival gazebo, Vicky staged her final act, a public settlement meeting executed with all the finesse of a Broadway production. She had arranged for microphones, speakers, and an oversized cardboard check for $300,000, playing to the cameras as if she were receiving an Academy Award for Best Supporting Victim. "Ladies and gentlemen," she declared to the assembled crowd, dabbing at her eyes with tissues that seemed suspiciously dry. "I am here to show how reasonable people can settle their differences without tearing families apart." The large check waved in the breeze, a surrender flag woven from deceit. I played my role in this theatrical production, feigning to weigh her proposal while federal agents moved into position around the festival, like pieces on a chessboard. The smells of barbecue and cotton candy could not conceal the approaching metallic taste of justice, which was moving faster than a summer thunderstorm. Dr. Sarah Lightfoot made a discreet entrance during the children's puppet show, her EPA testing equipment concealed in a family picnic basket. She started taking soil and water samples around the festival grounds and found that fresh concrete had been poured over the wetlands during the night, an act of evidence tampering that added federal obstruction charges to the already long list of offenses. That same morning, Ruby's financial investigation had traced the money laundering to an international source. Heritage Meadows had been financed by Russian shell companies that were part of a real estate fraud syndicate active in 12 states. Brad Ashworth was not merely a local swindler. He was a player in an international criminal network that made the local corruption seem like petty theft. Maria Santos, an elementary school teacher who resided in Heritage Meadows with her 2 young daughters, went to Ruby during the face painting session. Her hands shook as she presented the forged notary signatures on her deed, having recognized Brad's handwriting from his campaign flyers. "I trusted them," Maria murmured, casting a worried look at her children, who were having butterfly designs painted on their faces. "They told us we were purchasing our forever home, but it was all a fabrication." Her act of courage would be the fissure that broke Vicky's carefully constructed image of a community protector. The media ambush occurred during the lunch hour, when Brad had set up a surprise television interview to undermine my credibility. As the Channel 7 cameras were rolling, he depicted me as a bewildered elderly man who was putting innocent families at risk with his delusions of property ownership that posed a threat to children's safety. The interview was cut short by federal marshals who served him with an arrest warrant. Live on television, Brad's expression shifted from smug self-assurance to sheer panic more quickly than a teenager caught shoplifting, as handcuffs were snapped around his wrists during the broadcast. His assertions about a deep state conspiracy and government overreach made for perfect sound bites for the evening news. Vicky's composure shattered when she grasped that Brad's arrest had laid bare their entire scheme. Standing near the bounce house where toddlers were engaged in innocent play, she began to yell at the federal agents about her constitutional rights and government persecution. Her claims that the EPA was involved in a liberal plot against hardworking Americans were captured on numerous phones, creating viral social media content that obliterated any shred of credibility she had left. While families were enjoying their barbecue and checking their phones, Ruby's newspaper published the complete evidence package online. Interactive timelines laid out the 4-year fraud conspiracy, financial records proved the international money laundering, and document comparisons showed systematic forgery. The truth spread through the internet faster than small-town gossip, a force that local corruption could not suppress. Reverend Mitchell quickly arranged an emergency meeting for residents at the Methodist Church, offering a safe haven for displaced families, while legal aid volunteers provided free consultations. Local businesses came forward with job offers for residents who were facing financial ruin, demonstrating that true community spirit could overcome the blight of suburban greed. EPA tests confirmed that the groundwater contamination extended throughout the entire area, leading to an immediate evacuation of Heritage Meadows families to local motels at federal expense. The water supply was deemed unsafe, and the projected cleanup costs for the environmental restoration, which could take decades, were estimated at $25 million. U.S. Marshals cordoned off Heritage Meadows as a federal crime scene, giving residents 48 hours to retrieve their personal items before the evidence collection process began. The subdivision that had once symbolized stolen American dreams now stood as a stark reminder of the consequences of greed masquerading as community progress. The web of corruption unraveled more quickly than a cheap ball of yarn. County Sheriff Mike Ashworth was arrested for accepting bribes. 3 city council members were hit with federal charges for money laundering, and the bank president was indicted for mortgage fraud. The FBI launched investigations into all of the Ashworth's business activities, uncovering a pattern of systematic theft that had been going on for 2 decades. Vicky made a desperate attempt to flee as federal agents closed in. She was apprehended by airport security at Nashville International with suitcases filled with $2.3 million in bearer bonds, which she claimed were her retirement savings, despite having no legitimate source of income. The bonds were traced to Cayman Islands accounts linked to the Russian money laundering ring. National media trucks descended on the scene as the story grew, turning a small-town festival into a judicial spectacle that would be studied by constitutional law professors for years to come. Social media hashtags like #HeritageScam and #JusticeForZeke began trending nationwide, showing that the classic tale of David versus Goliath still resonated with the American public. The stage was set for a public confrontation that would expose decades of corruption as the cameras rolled. The festival gazebo was transformed into a makeshift courtroom as federal agents, media crews, and a large portion of the county assembled for a confrontation that would have impressed historians of the Wild West. The sweet aroma of funnel cakes mingled with the sharp tension of exposed corruption, while the sound of children's laughter served as an innocent backdrop to the downfall of the Heritage Meadows criminal organization. I approached the microphone, with my grandfather's surveyor's compass hanging around my neck like a protective charm, and held the original 1924 railroad easement document that was about to change the course of events. My voice resonated across the crowd without the need for a microphone. 40 years of calling out property lines had taught me how to command attention. Ladies and gentlemen, I started, my gaze fixed on Vicky, who was frozen in place like a deer caught in headlights. I am here to clarify the situation regarding my family's land and the criminals who believed they could get away with stealing it. The crowd became hushed, the only sounds being the distant crackle of federal agents' radios and the rustle of evidence papers in the Tennessee wind. I read key sections of my grandfather's contract aloud, detailing how the 1924 railroad easement automatically granted ownership of any unauthorized construction to the Thornfield family. Every house, every street light, and every blade of grass in Heritage Meadows is legally mine under federal law, I declared, holding up the yellow document as if it were the Ten Commandments. My grandfather was shrewd enough to safeguard our family from precisely this kind of theft. Vicky forced her way through the crowd like a woman driven by madness, seizing the microphone with the desperation of someone witnessing their entire world collapse in an instant. "This is all a fabrication, based on counterfeit documents," she shrieked, her meticulously curated suburban composure finally shattering like cheap glass. "These people are all part of a plot against hard-working families." It was at this point that U.S. Attorney Marcus Webb came forward, holding arrest warrants. His federal authority sliced through the local corruption as easily as a hot knife through butter. The crowd watched in silent disbelief as he recited the charges against Victoria Ashworth, 47 counts, which included fraud, money laundering, environmental offenses, and conspiracy to commit theft. "You have the right to remain silent," Marcus stated, as federal marshals fastened handcuffs around Vicky's wrists. Her perfectly manicured hands appeared almost delicate in the metal cuffs, a fitting representation of the fragility of her criminal scheme. The residents of Heritage Meadows responded with a mix of confusion and fury that divided the crowd more swiftly than a bolt of lightning. Maria Santos stepped up to represent the families who had been duped by their own American dream. "We simply wanted homes for our children," she said, her voice shaking with both emotion and a sense of betrayal. "We had no idea about any fraud. We placed our trust and our life savings in these people." Some of the residents directed their anger at Vicky as they finally grasped the extent of their manipulation, while others continued to defend her, clinging to a desperate hope that their property investments were not completely worthless. The division within the community was heart-wrenching to witness. Good people pitted against each other by criminals who had concealed their actions behind a veneer of suburban respectability. I took the microphone once more, addressing the bewildered families with the empathy that Martha had taught me. "You are all victims in this as well. This is not your fault. We will collaborate to set things right. I am proposing fair rent-to-own arrangements for anyone who wishes to remain while we navigate the legal complexities." Dr. Sarah Lightfoot then delivered the environmental bombshell, presenting her soil contamination results, which silenced even the most defensive of the residents. The subdivision had been constructed over the toxic remnants of an old chemical plant, and the groundwater contamination had spread well beyond the borders of Heritage Meadows. For health and safety reasons, all residents must evacuate immediately, Dr. Lightfoot announced, her EPA authority leaving no room for debate. The water supply is polluted, and the soil contains chemicals that present severe health hazards, particularly for children. The media frenzy erupted as reporters began to fire off questions more rapidly than an auctioneer's call. How could county officials have overlooked such blatant fraud? What is the total financial loss for the victims? Will this result in federal supervision of rural development? The story was quickly becoming a national emblem of small-town corruption and environmental negligence. County Sheriff Mike Ashworth arrived with his deputies, attempting to impose local authority over the federal agents in a jurisdictional showdown that would have been amusing if it weren't so pitiful. He soon discovered that he was also the subject of an investigation for accepting bribes when federal marshals presented him with his own arrest warrant. Ruby came forward to provide the assembled media with context, detailing how her investigation had revealed a conspiracy that spanned for years in multiple states. She acknowledged Danny Kowalski's bravery in exposing the construction fraud and environmental cover-ups that had put public health at risk. The defining moment occurred when I took out my surveyor's measuring tape and walked to the property line, clearly showing where Heritage Meadows was situated on Thornfield land. This measuring tape doesn't deceive, unlike some individuals, I remarked, looking straight at Vicky as she was being escorted into a federal transport vehicle. From the back of the police car, Vicky let out her final tirade. These people don't deserve nice homes anyway. The racial slurs that she then directed at the Hispanic families in the crowd exposed the true nature hidden beneath her suburban facade and confirmed the discriminatory motives that Ruby had suspected all along. Festival Day had turned into a public spectacle of corruption being brought to justice, broadcast live on social media, and covered by national news networks. Justice was served cold, with a side of environmental protection, all for half of Tennessee to witness. 6 months later, Heritage Meadows was a suburban ghost town. Yellow EPA tape flapped in the Tennessee breeze where meticulously kept lawns had once displayed their artificial splendor. The sweet fragrance of honeysuckle had made a comeback, blending with the morning dew and the rich scent of healthy earth as nature began to reclaim the stolen land. My cattle were now grazing contentedly where cookie-cutter McMansions had once stood like architectural blights, a testament to the fact that good land will always prevail over flawed ideas. The legal proceedings concluded with a federal efficiency that would have made Martha proud. Vicky Ashworth was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. It seems that orange jumpsuits do not come with HOA badges. Brad was given a 20-year sentence for racketeering, while Sheriff Mike Ashworth and 3 city council members received 5-year stays, courtesy of the federal penitentiary system. New oversight measures now ensure that future property thieves will need more skilled lawyers and larger bribes. 23 families from Heritage Meadows took up my rent-to-own offers, constructing sustainable homes on land that was properly zoned and in compliance with environmental laws and legitimate property rights. Maria Santos took on the role of our community liaison. Her children now enjoy playing in clean streams where toxic runoff used to be. Observing children catching salamanders in the restored wetlands served as a powerful reminder of why we had fought so tenaciously. The Thornfield Foundation was established with $20 million from the property settlement, providing scholarships for first-generation college students who appreciate that integrity and hard work are always superior to suburban manipulation. The Martha Thornfield Memorial Library is now a central feature of downtown Sweetwater Springs, hosting free legal aid clinics to assist property owners in defending themselves against corporate predators armed with clipboards and insincere smiles. 400 acres were designated as the Thornfield Wildlife Sanctuary, safeguarding endangered salamanders and wetlands, and serving as an educational resource for future generations on the importance of environmental stewardship. The climate research station on the property draws scientists from 3 universities, demonstrating that conservation and education can generate more employment than fraudulent development ever could. Ruby's Pulitzer Prize was a stepping stone to a career at the Washington Post, but she makes it a point to come back each year for our Thornfield Heritage Festival. Her Emmy-winning documentary on heritage meadows is now a standard part of the curriculum in journalism schools, imparting to students the valuable lesson that quality reporting can indeed save communities from ruin. Danny Kowalski testified before Congress about corruption in the construction industry, leading to the strengthening of whistleblower protections that now carry his name. His environmental restoration firm hires other workers who have prioritized their conscience over corporate demands. It turns out that honesty is more profitable than fraud and carries a significantly lower risk of federal indictment. The case had a national impact that surpassed all our expectations. FBI investigations revealed similar fraudulent schemes in 47 communities, resulting in the shutdown of $2.3 billion in illicit developments. Congressional task forces established new federal property verification protocols that shield families from professional criminals disguised as community developers. I now teach surveying at the local community college, passing on 40 years of knowledge to students who will be responsible for protecting the next generation from boundary conflicts and property fraud. The primary lesson is that America was built on precise measurements and honest documentation. Everything else is merely costly embellishment. Our annual Heritage Festival is a celebration of genuine local history, featuring crafts, music, and storytelling that pay tribute to authentic community values. Former adversaries now work together on planning committees, a testament to how a shared objective can mend divisions caused by greed more effectively than any therapeutic intervention. The environmental recovery has exceeded our most optimistic projections. Endangered species are returning to the restored wetlands. Educational boardwalks provide school groups with the opportunity to observe ecosystem regeneration. And the research data is helping farmers to adapt to climate change while also protecting delicate habitats. The metallic flavor of morning mist over thriving wetlands is far superior to suburban chlorine any day. Personal healing arrived like a Tennessee sunrise, first slowly and then all at once, painting everything in the colors that Martha had loved. I visit her grave every evening to update her on the community's advancements and the scholarship recipients who are benefiting from our stand against corruption. The final entry in her journal remains my guiding principle. Zeke fights for what's right, not what's easy. This experience has taught me that advocating for what is right often means you will stand alone at the start, but that honest documentation and principled allies will eventually draw good people to your side. My grandfather knew that owning land comes with a duty to future generations, who deserve more than environmental ruin masked as progress. Property rights are crucial because they shield families from predators who exploit the American dream for their own gain. When someone attempts to take your land, they are not just stealing soil. They are taking your family's heritage and your children's future. Sharing these stories can empower others to stand firm against those who would exploit their communities for personal profit, proving that when honest people unite, justice can prevail.